In a fog-shrouded Maine village in 1895, a widowed schoolteacher was about to raise her hand at a county auction. What started as a simple bid for an abandoned watchtower took a shocking turn when she came face to face with 50 cents that would buy her a fortune and a deadly conspiracy. Margaret Maggie. Whittaker wasn't your typical grieving widow. For 6 years, she had spent her life teaching grammar to Boston children, known for her sharp eye for detail and her lighthouse keeper father's lessons. Follow the signal, even when the world is fog. When she purchased the cursed coastal watchtower for 50 cents, she had no idea she was walking into a web of corruption that had silenced her father forever. Maggie discovered a hidden chamber containing $22 million in stolen war of 1812 gold, and ledgers proving the sheriff and his network had been profiting from it for 20 years. Her refusal to sign away her discovery would lead to a flooding chamber, a desperate standoff, and a federal investigation that would shake the entire coastline. What began as a purchase meant to honor her father's memory would become a battle between one woman's courage and a corrupt empire built on murder and theft. The Maine fishing village would never be the same after the schoolteacher chose truth over treasure and taught an entire community that some lights refuse to be extinguished, no matter how thick the fog. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fog came in like it always did along the Maine coast, thick as secrets and twice as cold. Margaret Whittaker stood at the edge of the crowd, with her father's brass compass pressed against her palm through the worn fabric of her coat pocket. The metal was warm from her body heat, which felt wrong somehow. Dead men's possessions should stay cold. The auctioneer's voice carried strangely through the mist, words arriving at different speeds, as if the fog itself was deciding what information mattered. Item 47. Coastal watchtower, derelict condition, sold as is, with all structures and foundations therein. Maggie had taught grammar to Boston children for 6 years before her father died. She knew the weight of a word like therein. It suggested more than wood and stone. It suggested something hidden in the definition itself. Do I hear 25 cents? The men around her shifted their boots against the damp earth. Fishing village men, with faces carved by salt wind and disappointment. They'd come to the auction, hoping for equipment, tools, anything that might reverse the slow starvation that had settled over the village when the shipping trade moved inland. They had not come for a cursed tower. Maggie raised her hand. The movement felt enormous, as if she'd lifted not just her arm, but some great weight that had been pressing on her shoulders since the telegram arrived 3 months ago. Your father, lost at sea, body not recovered. She'd read those words so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth. 25 cents to the lady. The auctioneer's eyes found hers through the fog, and something in his expression made her fingers tighten around the compass. Do I hear 50? Silence answered. The kind of silence that has texture and opinion. Maggie raised her hand again. 50 cents. The auctioneer's gavel hovered. Going once. A voice emerged from her left, smooth as oiled leather. Quite the investment, Mrs. Whittaker. Sheriff Elias Crane materialized from the fog, like a man who'd been standing there all along, just waiting for the right moment to become visible. His uniform was pressed despite the damp air, buttons gleaming as if he polished them each morning with the same attention some men gave to prayer. Going twice. Sheriff. Maggie didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the tower's shadow, barely visible through the mist, a dark shape against darker sky. I didn't realize you attended estate auctions. I take an interest in public safety. His smile carried no warmth, particularly when it involves structures with documented maintenance hazards. That tower has stood empty for good reason. Sold to Mrs. Margaret Whittaker for 50 cents. The gavel struck wood with a sound like a door closing. Crane stepped closer, and Maggie caught the scent of tobacco and something else. Bay rum, perhaps? The kind of cologne that announced a man had money to spend on vanity. I'd be happy to inspect the property with you. Before you make any rash decisions about restoration, that's very kind. Maggie finally turned to face him fully. Up close, she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, white as bone. But I've already made my decision. I'm going to convert it into a schoolhouse for the village children. Something flickered in Crane's pale eyes. Surprise, maybe? Or calculation. A schoolhouse. How civic-minded. He touched the brim of his hat. Do let me know if you encounter any difficulties. Old buildings can hold unexpected surprises. He walked away before she could respond, his boots making no sound on the wet grass. The fog swallowed him as completely as it had produced him. The auction crowd dispersed quickly after that, men returning to boats and wagons with their purchased lots. Maggie approached the clerk's table where the deed transfer would be recorded. The clerk was a thin man with ink stained fingers and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many years reading poor handwriting by lamplight, Mrs. Whittaker. He didn't look up from his ledger. Sign here, please. She signed, then let her eyes drift across the open page while he prepared the deed. The auction listings were recorded in cramped script, dates and prices marching down the columns. But one entry kept repeating. Item 47. Coastal Watchtower. Listed in 1889, 1891, 1893, and now 1895. Each time withdrawn before sale. Until today. Is something wrong? The clerk's pen had stopped moving. Just wondering. Maggie kept her voice light. Why was the tower listed so many times? Title complications. He blotted the deed carefully. Previous owners couldn't be located, or chose not to claim the property. Makes you wonder what they knew that you don't. He handed her the folded document with a smile that said he'd performed his civic duty by warning her, and whatever happened next was her own fault. Maggie accepted the deed and turned to find Clara Duval waiting by the edge of the clerk's tent, a shawl pulled tight against the damp. Clara ran the only inn in the village, a 3-story building that had once housed ship captains and now sheltered whoever could pay. She was perhaps 10 years older than Maggie, with grey threading through dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. Well, Clara's voice carried equal parts warmth and exasperation. You've done it now. Done what? Bought the tower everyone else was smart enough to avoid? But Clara was smiling as she said it. She reached into her bag and produced a heavy iron key. This is for the room I'm holding for you. 2nd floor, faces the harbour. Quietest one I have. Clara, I can't possibly— You can and you will. Clara pressed the key into Maggie's palm. Then she leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Keep your light low. Before Maggie could ask what that meant, Clara had turned and was walking back toward the village proper, her shawl a grey shape dissolving. Into the grey air, Maggie stood alone with her deed and her key, and the compass that had belonged to a lighthouse keeper who'd taught her to read. Signal patterns before she could read words. The fog pressed close on all sides, and somewhere beyond it, the Atlantic threw itself against Blackstone cliffs with the patience of something that had been doing the same thing for millennia, and would continue long after all the people and their secrets had turned to salt. She pulled the compass from her pocket and opened the tarnished case. The needle swung, settled, pointed north, but it was the engraving on the inner lid that held her attention. A symbol she'd never understood. A circle with 3 lines extending outward like a strange star, or a child's drawing of the sun. Her father had never explained it, and she'd never thought to ask, until she'd seen the same symbol carved into the base of the Watchtower during the auction viewing, hidden in shadow, where most people wouldn't notice it, unless they were looking for something specific. Maggie closed the compass and started walking toward the cliffs. The path to the tower was overgrown with beach roses and wild grasses that hissed against her skirt. Maggie walked slowly, letting her eyes adjust to the shifting visibility. The fog came in layers here, thick patches alternating with sudden clearings where she could see 20 feet or more. The effect was disorienting, like moving through rooms with invisible walls. The tower emerged gradually. First the suggestion of verticality, a darkness more solid than fog. Then details, weathered wood siding, narrow windows like watching eyes. The peaked roof with its rusted weather vane, frozen pointing east, as if permanently warning of storms that had already passed. Maggie stopped at the base and ran her fingers along the wood. The surface was rough with salt damage and age, but when she looked closer, she could see evidence of recent maintenance. Someone had oiled the hinges on the iron-banded door. The steps leading up to the entrance had been cleared of debris. Someone had been taking care of this supposedly abandoned watchtower. The sound of metal on metal made her turn. A man was working on an iron gate, perhaps 30 yards away, fitting a new hinge with careful precision. He was broad-shouldered and moved with the economy of motion that came from physical work done well and often. When he straightened, she could see he favored his left leg, Mrs. Whittaker. His voice was gravelled by weather or tobacco, or both. "Congratulations on your purchase, thank you. I'm sorry, have we met?" "Silas Boone." He wiped his hands on a rag and limped closer. "I keep the forge down in the village. Sheriff Crane hired me to repair the gate mechanisms before the auction. Didn't think anyone would actually buy the place." Up close, Maggie could see Silas was younger than his manner suggested. Perhaps 40, with grey already threading his dark beard and lines carved deep around his eyes. The kind of face that had seen something it couldn't unsee. "But you're here anyway." Maggie gestured to the gate, finishing the work. "A job's a job." Silas glanced at the tower, then back at Maggie. "You really planning to turn that into a schoolhouse?" "I am." He nodded slowly, as if considering whether to say more. "The ironwork's good, older than the structure itself. Whoever built this used ship fittings. The kind they use for cargo holds on vessels meant to carry weight in rough seas. That's an odd choice for a watchtower, isn't it?" Silas met her eyes directly. "Also, someone's been maintaining the metal. I can tell by the wear patterns and the oil quality. Recent work. Within the last few months, the fog shifted, and for a moment the lighthouse on the distant point was visible, its white tower standing sentinel against the grey. Then the mist closed in again like a curtain. Would you have time to look at the interior stairs?" Maggie surprised herself with the question. "I'll need them stabilized before I can bring students here safely." Silas studied her for a long moment. "You're not leaving this alone, are you?" "I'm sorry?" "The tower, the secrets it's holding." He gestured toward the base where the symbol was carved. "You've seen the marks." "You're asking questions." "That's not the behavior of someone who just wants a building for teaching reading and arithmetic." Maggie felt her face warm, despite the cold air. "My father was the lighthouse keeper. He died 3 months ago. They said it was an accident. I know. I was on the rescue boat that searched for him." Silas's expression didn't change, but his voice softened almost imperceptibly. "We found pieces of his launch." "Not much else. I'm sorry for your loss." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of genuine experience. This was a man who understood loss, measured in empty boats and unanswered questions. "Thank you." Maggie pulled her shawl tighter. "Will you help me with the stairs?" "Tomorrow morning, early, before the village starts moving." Silas picked up his tool bag. "And Mrs. Whittaker? The tides here can erase footprints and evidence. Remember that." He limped away down the path, leaving Maggie alone with her tower and her questions, and the growing certainty that her 50-cent purchase had cost her father considerably more. She climbed the steps and tried the door. It opened easily, hinges silent with recent oil. Inside, the tower was dim and smelled of salt and old wood and something metallic underneath. The ground floor was circular, perhaps 20 feet across, with a spiral staircase climbing toward the upper levels. What little light entered came from narrow slit windows, designed more for observation than illumination. Maggie lit the small lantern she'd brought and began a slow circuit of the room. The walls were bare stone at the base, transitioning to wood framework higher up. The floor was flagstone, uneven with age and settlement. She knelt and ran her fingers along the seams between stones. There, a hairline crack that didn't match the others. Not random settlement, but a deliberate cut, mortared over, but still visible if you knew to look for geometric patterns instead of organic wear. Her father had taught her that. How to read structure, how to see the difference between what time did to a building and what people did. She pulled the compass from her pocket and held it near the suspicious seam. The needle wavered, swung slightly off true north, then settled again. She moved the compass along the floor. Near certain stones the needle drifted. Near others it stayed steady. Magnetic interference. Iron deposits, maybe. Or something else hidden beneath the floor. Maggie stood and continued her inspection, documenting everything she saw in the small notebook she'd brought. Her father had kept journals. Meticulous records of weather patterns, tide times, ship passages. She'd read them all after he died, searching for answers and finding only data. Columns of numbers and observations that seemed to point towards something without ever quite revealing what. The light through the slit windows was fading when she finally descended. The fog had thickened further, and visibility had dropped to perhaps 15 feet. Maggie secured the door and started down the path toward the village. She was perhaps halfway back when she heard it. 3 distinct sounds carrying across the water. Not quite foghorns, sharper, more deliberate. 3 flashes. 2 beats of silence. 3 more flashes. She stopped walking and turned toward the lighthouse. Her father's signal. The distress pattern he taught her when she was 8 years old. If you ever see this pattern, Maggie, it means trouble that can't... Wait, but her father was dead. Someone else was using his... Clara's inn smelled of fish stew and wood smoke and the peculiar musty warmth of a building that had stood against sea. Weather for 3 generations. Maggie found her room on the 2nd floor exactly as promised. Small, clean, with a narrow bed and a window that faced the harbor. The lamp was already lit, turned low, casting just enough light to navigate by. Keep your light low. Maggie understood now. Clara was telling her to be careful, to not draw attention, to remember that in a small village everyone noticed who kept late hours and what they might be reading by lamplight. She spread her father's journals across the bed. 5 years of daily entries, each page filled with his careful engineer's handwriting. Weather observations, tide charts, ship passages logged with names and tonnages, and scattered throughout seemingly random notes. 3 long, 2 short, 1 long. Pattern repeated 2,300 hours. Signal confirmed harborside. Maggie had thought they were lighthouse signals. Standard maritime communication. But now, laid out in sequence, she could see they formed something else. A conversation. Someone on shore signaling to the lighthouse. Her father responding. Back and forth across months, then years. A knock on the door made her look up. It's Clara. Maggie opened the door to find the innkeeper carrying a tray with tea and bread. She entered quickly and closed the door behind her with her hip. You'll want something warm. And we should talk where walls don't have ears. Clara set the tray on the small table and gestured to the journals. Are those your father's records? Yes. I'm trying to make sense of his signal patterns. Clara poured tea with steady hands. May I see? Maggie handed her the most recent journal, open to a page from 2 months before her father's death. Clara studied it in silence, her expression growing progressively more grim. Your father was a good man. Maggie, I know. I mean, he was a good man who made enemies by refusing to look away. Clara set the journal down. Do you remember my husband? Captain James Duval? Vaguely. He died before I moved to Boston. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was a smuggler. Clara said it flatly, without shame or apology. Not a proud profession, but a profitable one when the shipping trade dried up. He kept notebooks, codes and signals for safe houses along the coast. I kept them after he died. Never knew why. Maybe I thought they were all I'd have left of him. She pulled a small leather-bound book from her apron pocket. I recognized something in your father's notes. The pattern. So I went looking. She opened her late husband's notebook and laid it beside the journal. There, see the symbols? Maggie leaned closer. On the facing pages, repeated across different dates, was the same mark carved into the tower and engraved on her father's compass. The circle with 3 radiating lines. It's a smuggler's mark, Clara said quietly. Used to identify safe routes and storage locations. But James only used it when he was working for powerful men. Men with badges and legal authority. Men who could make his little operation part of something much larger. You're saying my father was involved in smuggling? I'm saying your father was investigating it. Clara pulled out another page, this one covered in numbers. These are tide tables. James used them to know when it was safe to move cargo, when the water level would hide the entrance to certain caves or cellars, when the fog would be thick enough to avoid the revenue cutters. Maggie looked between the pages. Her father's signal patterns, the tide tables, the compass with its engraved symbol. Suddenly the fragments began to form a picture. It's a map, she said slowly. Not of where, of when. Exactly. Clara's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. The tower isn't marked because of what it contains. It's marked because of when you can access what it contains. Your father was tracking the optimal times, recording them in a code that looked like standard lighthouse work, and someone figured out what he was doing. I think someone powerful has been using that tower for years, decades maybe. Your father started noticing patterns, ships arriving at odd times, signals that didn't match standard maritime codes. He was too good at his job, too observant. And eventually he saw something that made him dangerous. Maggie felt her hands shaking slightly. She set down her teacup carefully. The 3 flashes I heard tonight. That was his distress code. Someone else knows it now. They might be warning you, or threatening you. Clara reached across the table and gripped Maggie's wrist. You need to decide if you're going to walk away from this or see it through. Because once you start pulling threads, the whole fabric comes loose. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the darkness, the lighthouse beam swept its eternal circuit. Maggie thought about her father's last words to her before she'd left for Boston. Follow the signal, even when the world is fog. She'd thought he meant to trust her instincts, to stay true to her principles, despite the chaos of the world. But maybe he'd meant it more literally. Follow the signal, the pattern, the code he'd left behind like breadcrumbs for someone smart enough to read them. I need to go back to the tower, Maggie said. At the next low fog. When the tide is right, Clara nodded slowly. Then we'd better compare these notebooks properly. Figure out exactly when that will be. And Maggie, she squeezed her wrist once more before releasing it. I'm coming with you. You'll need someone to watch your back. And I've got no love for the men who took over James's roots after they made sure he couldn't talk about where the real money was going. They bent over the pages together, 2 widows by lamplight translating the private language of dead men into a map that would lead them back to the Watchtower at exactly the right moment, when the sea pulled back its curtain and revealed what had been hidden beneath 50 cents and decades of silence. Outside the window, if Maggie had looked, she might have seen a figure standing motionless in the fog near the edge of the docks, watching the inn, watching her window, counting the hours until low tide and measuring the distance between curiosity and proof, between inheritance and theft, between a schoolteacher asking questions and a woman becoming dangerous enough to silence. But Maggie didn't look up. She was too busy following the signal. The fog returned 3 nights later, rolling in with the particular thickness that Clara's husband's notes had called merchant's weather. Maggie and Silas approached the tower by lantern light, their breath visible in the cold air, footsteps muffled by damp earth and the eternal thunder of waves against stone. Silas carried a canvas bag of tools that clinked softly with each step. He'd said nothing when Maggie arrived at his forge that afternoon with the overlaid notebooks and the calculated tide times. He'd simply nodded, closed his shop early, and begun gathering pry bars and wedges. Inside the tower, Maggie knelt beside the flagstone seam she'd marked. The lantern cast jumping shadows against the curved walls. She pulled out her father's compass and held it over each stone in sequence, watching the needle's behavior. Here, the compass needle swung wildly, pointing down instead of north. And here, another stone. Same reaction, magnetic concentration. Silas ran his fingers along the seams. Iron reinforcement below. Significant amounts to pull the needle that hard. Maggie counted the signal flashes from her father's journal. 3 long. 2 short, 1 long. She pressed the stones in sequence, matching the rhythm to the pattern. Nothing happened. She tried again, this time aligning the compass rose with the carved symbol on the wall. The third stone shifted beneath her hand, with a grinding sound that seemed to come from deep below. Silas moved quickly, wedging a pry bar into the gap. Together they levered the stone upward. It pivoted on a hidden hinge, revealing darkness and the smell of salt water and old metal. A spiral staircase descended into the cliff itself. Iron-braced, like a ship's interior, the steps were narrow and steep, disappearing into shadow beyond the lantern's reach. "Someone's been down here recently," Silas pointed to the bolts securing the iron braces. "These have been turned within the last few months. You can see fresh tool marks in the corrosion." Maggie lifted the lantern and started down. The stairs wound tight, following the natural curve of the cliff face. Water seeped through cracks in the stone, trickling down in thin streams that caught the light like silver threads. The air grew colder with each step, pressing against her skin with the weight of the earth above. At the bottom, perhaps 40 feet below the tower's foundation, they found a passage braced with ship timbers. Great fragments littered the floor, some stamped with dates. 1812, 1813. The Federal Eagle was visible on several pieces, but overstamped with another mark. A merchant's seal. Private enterprise masquerading as government work. This was a storage vault. Silas held his lantern close to the timbers. Naval supply cache, maybe. For the war effort. Or something they wanted people to believe was for the war effort. Maggie picked up a crate fragment. The wood was solid despite its age, well maintained. Clara said powerful men used smuggling as cover. What if they used the war as cover too? The passage ended at an iron door, riveted shut with bolts as thick as her wrist. A faint metallic scent leaked through the seams. Not rust, something cleaner. Like the inside of a mint. Maggie pressed her palm against the cold metal. Behind this door was the answer. The reason her father had died. The secret that had been worth killing to protect will need cutting tools, Silas said. Those bolts won't budge without... Footsteps echoed from above. Multiple sets. Then a voice carrying down the spiral stairs with the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. "For your safety, Mrs. Whittaker, I must insist you come up immediately." Sheriff Crane's voice, smooth as ever, but with an edge beneath it sharp as a filleting knife. Crane descended with Deputy Charles Pike behind him, their lamps casting competing shadows that made the narrow passage seem to shift and breathe. Pike was younger, perhaps 30, with the kind of face that would always look uncertain even when holding a weapon, which he was. His hand rested on his holstered pistol with the nervous energy of someone hoping not to use it. "This is county property," Crane said, reaching the bottom step. "Unsecured structures pose a public hazard. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave while we conduct a proper assessment." "I own this tower." Maggie didn't move from her position by the iron door. "The deed is registered and legal. The deed is for the structure above ground." Crane pulled a folded document from his coat. This subterranean space was not disclosed in the original survey. As such, it falls under county jurisdiction pending proper review. He held out the paper. Maggie took it, angling it toward the lantern light. The document looked official. County seal. Legal language. But something was wrong with the ink. The main text was slightly faded, the way documents aged, but certain words were darker, fresher, as if they'd been added recently to an old form. This signature... Maggie pointed to the bottom of the page. "It doesn't match the notary seal. Different pen, different pressure." Pike shifted his weight, his hand tightening on his pistol grip. Crane's expression didn't change, but his eyes went cold in a way that reminded Maggie of deep water where the sun never reached. "You're implying forgery." "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Whittaker. I'm observing facts." Maggie folded the paper carefully. "Just as I'm observing that someone has been maintaining this space. Oiling hinges, replacing bolts, checking on whatever is behind that door. Was that county business too, Sheriff? What's behind the door isn't your concern. It was my father's concern, and it got him killed." The words hung in the cold air between them. Pike's eyes widened slightly. Crane's face remained impassive, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your father's death was ruled an accident," Crane said quietly. "The launch capsized in rough seas. A tragedy, but not uncommon for these waters. His launch was sabotaged. Someone cut the fuel line nearly through, so it would fail once he was far enough from shore." Maggie pulled a fragment of crate label from her pocket. "And I'm betting the proof is behind that door, along with records that show exactly who's been profiting from this vault for the last 20 years. Silas moved to stand beside her, his broad frame blocking the passage. "I think the lady's made her position clear." Crane studied them both for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Deputy Pike, note that Mrs. Whittaker and Mr. Boone have refused to comply with a lawful order and are trespassing in a secured area." "Sheriff, I don't think—" Pike's voice was uncertain. "Note it." Crane's voice cracked like a whip. Pike pulled out a small notebook, hands shaking slightly as he began to write. "You'll leave now," Crane continued, "or I'll be forced to place you under arrest for obstruction. And in the confusion, who knows what might happen to the evidence you claim to have found." Maggie met his gaze. She could see it now. The calculation. The man who'd spent years building his reputation as a war hero and lawman, all while running a network that had crushed families and broken lives for profit. A man who would do whatever necessary to protect that legacy. But she could also see something else. Desperation. He needed whatever was behind that door. Needed it badly enough to threaten and forge documents and show his hand more than he wanted to. Which meant he was losing control of the situation. "Come on, Maggie." Silas touched her arm gently. "There's more than one way to open a locked door, and more than one kind of key." She understood. They would retreat, regroup, come back with evidence. And witnesses Crane couldn't intimidate or silence. Her father's signal code hadn't been a treasure map. It had been a warning system, a way to call for help when the fog grew too thick to see the truth. Maggie let Silas guide her past Crane and up the spiral stairs. As they climbed, she heard Pike's voice, barely a whisper. "Sheriff, about that signature—" "Not now, Charles." They emerged into the tower's ground floor and found Clara waiting by the door, her face pale in the moonlight that had broken through the thinning fog. "I saw them come," she said quickly. "3 men total. The third is watching from the ridge. We're leaving." Maggie locked eyes with Clara. "But not for long. We need to find someone who was there. Someone who saw what happened the night my father died." Clara nodded slowly. "Then you need to talk to Keeper." Old Jacob Keeper Millen lived in a shack that seemed to be holding on to the cliff face through stubbornness alone. The path to reach it was barely visible, more suggestion than trail, winding along the rocky shore where the sea spray made every step treacherous. Maggie climbed carefully in the morning light, using exposed roots and rocks as handholds. Behind her, Clara moved with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey before. "He doesn't always make sense," Clara warned as they approached. "Some days he thinks it's 20 years ago. Others he's sharp as broken glass. But he was your father's assistant keeper. If anyone knows what Horace saw, it's Jacob." The shack was built from driftwood and salvaged ship timber, its walls decorated, with buoys and rope and pieces of colored glass that caught the light like jewels. Smoke rose from a metal pipe chimney, and Maggie could smell fish cooking. An old man sat on the doorstep, mending a net with gnarled fingers that moved with surprising dexterity. His beard was white as foam, his skin weathered dark by decades of sun and salt. But his eyes were bright when he looked up. "Maggie," his voice was cracked but warm, "you've got your father's walk. Same purposeful stride, like you're leaning into wind even on a calm day." "Hello, Jacob." Maggie crouched beside him. "I need to ask you about the night he died." The old man's hands stilled on the net. I wondered when you'd come. Hoped you wouldn't have to, but hope's a poor defense against men who kill for gold. You know about the vault? Know about it? Jacob laughed, the sound bitter. I helped your father seal it 20 years back, after we figured out what it really was. Not government money, stolen money, diverted from the war effort by men in positions of trust. Your father wanted to report it. I told him that was signing his death warrant. He set the net aside and stood, moving to the shack's interior. He returned with a battered brass shutter from a signal lamp, its surface etched with the familiar three-rayed symbol. We used this to send false signals, made the smugglers think we were part of their network, learned their schedules, their contacts. Your father documented everything. Jacob's eyes grew distant. The night he died, he'd seen something that frightened him, a boat that shouldn't have been there. A signal pattern that meant someone high up was making a run. He was going to record it, get proof that would force the federal authorities to investigate what happened. I saw it from here, watched his launch go out, watched another boat follow 20 minutes later. No lights. Just a dark shape on dark water. Jacob's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Heard an engine cough. Saw his lamp signal 3 flashes. Distress, then nothing. The other boat circled once and left. By the time I got down to the dock and convinced someone to help search, there was nothing to find but wreckage. Maggie felt her throat tighten. Did you see who was in the other boat? Too dark. But I know who had access to fast boats and reasons to keep the vault secret. Jacob pulled a water-stained piece of paper from his pocket. Found this tucked in a buoy near where your father's launch went down. The paper's ruined, but you can still make out initials. EC, and what looks like shipping manifest numbers. EC, Elias Crane. Why didn't you come forward? Who would believe an old man everyone thinks is half mad? Jacob pressed the paper into her hand. But you, Maggie, you bought that tower. You're asking questions. You're carrying your father's compass. That means you're the one he left this for. The one who can finish what he started. Clara spoke for the first time. Jacob, we need to open that iron door. Can you tell us how? Your father's compass. The symbol isn't just decoration. Jacob smiled sadly. It's a key. Line up the markings with the ones on the door. The rivets aren't all structural. Some are triggers. They returned to the tower at dead low tide, when the fog rolled in thick enough to hide their approach. This time they brought rope, tools, and a determination that felt sharp enough to cut stone. Silas worked quickly on the rivets Jacob had described, his blacksmith's knowledge translating the old man's cryptic instructions into action. Maggie held the compass against the door, aligning the engraved symbol with scratches on the iron surface that were barely visible beneath decades of oxidation. 3 rivets, Silas said, threaded differently from the others, counterclockwise to release. The first rivet turned with a grinding sound. The second resisted, then gave. The third turned easily, as if oiled recently. The door swung inward with a groan that seemed to come from the cliff itself. Cold air rushed out, carrying the scent of metal and old paper and something else. Money, the particular smell of large amounts of currency stored in darkness. Maggie lifted the lantern. The chamber was larger than she'd expected, carved from living rock and reinforced with ship timbers that spoke of naval engineering. Rows of wooden crates lined the walls, some marked with federal eagles, others with merchant seals she didn't recognize. In the center, a large iron strongbox sat on a stone pedestal, but it was the shelves along the back wall that drew her attention. Ledgers, stacks of papers, records preserved in the dry, cold air, like history holding its breath. Silas pried open one of the crates. Inside, nestled in straw, were gold coins, thousands of them, minted with dates from the War of 1812 period. This was meant to finance espionage networks, Clara breathed. Payment for intelligence gathering, compensation for spies. But someone diverted it, kept it here, used it to build their own empire, while families starved. Maggie opened the strongbox with a key she'd found taped inside her father's compass case. More gold, more coins, but also vouchers, coded payment authorizations, each one representing a fortune. She did rough calculations in her head based on the weight and quantity, $22 million. Perhaps more, enough to buy every official between here and Washington. Enough to make men kill to protect it. She turned to the ledgers. Her hands shook as she pulled the first volume from the shelf. Names, dates, payment amounts. A complete record of who had been paid what and when. Sheriff's deputies, county officials, judges, harbor masters, and there, repeated across 20 years of entries, E. Crane, Elias Crane, amounts that grew larger over time as he rose from deputy to sheriff. A sealed envelope fell from between the pages. It was addressed in her father's handwriting, to Margaret, if you're reading this. Maggie's vision blurred. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers. My darling girl, if you've found this chamber, then I've failed to expose it myself. I'm sorry to leave you this burden, but I trust you to do what's right. The gold was never meant for private hands. It belongs to the nation, to the people it was stolen from. Crane and his network have used it to build corruption that poisons everything it touches. Don't take the money. Use the records. Expose the living. That's the only way to honor the dead. Follow the signal, even when the world is fog. Your loving father, Maggie, folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket. Then she turned to Silas and Clara, her decision crystallizing like ice forming on winter water. We photograph the records. We document everything, but we don't take a single coin. She met their eyes. The gold stays here. The truth goes public. Maggie, Clara said softly, with that kind of money I could become exactly what my father died fighting against. Maggie shook her head. This chamber has been a secret too long. It's time for it to testify. Footsteps echoed in the passage outside. Multiple sets. Moving quickly, Silas moved to the doorway, then looked back at them, his face grim. It's Crane, and he's not alone this time. The sheriff's voice carried into the chamber, calm and cold. Mrs. Whittaker, I'm afraid you've left me no choice. Come out quietly, and we can discuss a reasonable arrangement. Maggie looked at the chamber, at the evidence of decades of corruption, at the choice her father had made that cost him his life. Then she looked at the signal lamp Silas had quietly brought down and assembled near the entrance. Her father had taught her to send signals, to call for help across darkness and distance. It was time to send one last message, one that couldn't be silenced or suppressed. Mr. Boone, she said quietly, how bright can you make that lamp burn? Silas smiled. It was not a kind expression. Bright enough to be seen from the revenue cutter that patrols these waters. Bright enough to send a pattern they'll recognize as distress. Bright enough to bring help that Crane can't bribe or threaten away. Then light it up, Maggie said. And let's see if the fog is willing to carry the truth for once. Outside, the tide was turning, and with it, everything else. The signal lamp blazed to life with an intensity that made shadows leap across the chamber walls. Silas had positioned it at the mouth of the passage where the light could shoot upward through the tower's open windows, a beacon calling across water and fog to anyone watching from the sea. 3 long flashes, 2 short, 1 long, the pattern repeated, urgent and unmistakable. Mrs. Whittaker. Crane's voice was closer now, just outside the iron door. That lamp won't save you. By the time any cutter investigates, this will all be resolved. Resolved, Maggie called back, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Is that what you call murdering my father? A resolution. A pause. Then footsteps, not advancing but repositioning. Crane was sealing the upper exit. Pike appeared in the doorway, young and uncertain, his pistol drawn but pointed at the floor. Behind him, 2 more deputies Maggie didn't recognize filled the narrow passage. Sheriff says you need to come out now, Pike said. His voice carried none of Crane's confidence. Says the tide's coming in. This chamber floods at high water. You'll drown if you stay here. Maggie looked at the floor. Water was already seeping through cracks in the stone, thin streams that caught the lamplight. She could hear the ocean's voice growing louder, the waves finding their way through ancient fissures in the cliff. Then I suggest the sheriff accepts that this chamber and everything in it will soon be federal evidence, Maggie said. or we all drown together with the truth. There's another option. Crane stepped into view behind Pike. In his hand, he held a folded document, a transfer of property and discovery rights. You sign this, acknowledging that the chamber and its contents were unknown to you, that you're relinquishing any claim in exchange for compensation. $20,000, Mrs. Whittaker, enough to start a real school. Buy a real building. Live comfortably for the rest of your life. Let me see it. Crane smiled and handed her the paper. Maggie read it by lamplight, her teacher's eye catching inconsistencies immediately. The notary seal at the bottom was smeared, with soot, covering what looked like an older mark beneath. The signature line for the county clerk was in different ink from the body text. And the date was from 2 weeks ago, before she'd even purchased the tower. You wrote this before the auction, Maggie said quietly. You've been planning this since you set the sale terms. You thought I'd find the chamber and you could force me to sign away any claim to it. Smart and pretty. Crane's smile didn't reach his eyes. Your father was smart too. Look where it got him. Pike flinched at that. His hand tightened on his pistol, but his face had gone pale. Deputy Pike. Maggie kept her eyes on Crane but spoke directly to the younger man. There are ledgers on those shelves, 20 years of payments to county officials. I saw your mother's name in the debtor records. The list of families who lost fishing boats because they couldn't pay fees that kept rising every year. Do you know why those fees increased? Pike said nothing, but his jaw tightened, because men like Sheriff Crane needed more money to maintain their networks, to pay off anyone who might ask questions. Your mother lost everything so he could profit from stolen gold meant to defend this country. That's enough. Crane's voice went cold. Charles, take the woman into custody. Use force if necessary. Pike didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the ledgers Clara was carefully pulling from the shelves, her hands quick and purposeful as she stacked them near the lamp where their titles were visible. Payment records, distribution logs, asset acquisition. Charles, Crane's voice cracked like a whip. I gave you an order. You gave a lot of orders over the years. Pike's voice was barely audible. How many of them were lies? The water was ankle deep. Now cold as January, soaking through Maggie's skirts. Above them, the lamp continued its urgent pattern. 3 long, 2 short, 1 long, a lighthouse keeper's daughter calling across the dark to anyone who remembered what honor meant. Silas moved to the signal apparatus, adjusting the reflector to send the beam higher. Revenue cutters out there, he said quietly. I can see her running lights through the fog. She's turning toward shore. Then we'd better hurry this along. Crane drew his own pistol, the metal gleaming in the lamplight. Mrs. Whittaker, you have 1 minute to sign that document, or I will regret to report that you and your accomplices drowned in a tragic accident while trespassing in a dangerous location. Maggie met his eyes. She could see it now. The desperation of a man who'd built an empire on stolen wealth and could feel it crumbling like the cliff face during a storm. He would kill them, all of them, because he had no other choice left, but neither did she. No, Maggie said simply. Crane raised his pistol. Pike moved faster, shoving his shoulder into Crane's arm. The shot went wide, the bullet striking stone and sending fragments spraying across the chamber. The sound was enormous in the confined space, echoing like thunder trapped underground. You fool, Crane rounded on his deputy. You've just ended your career. My career? Pike's voice was shaking but growing stronger. My career serving you. While you destroyed families, while you murdered good men. I'm done, Sheriff. I'm done with all of it. The storm hit the coast like a judgment. Wind drove the rain horizontal, and the sea rose with the fury of something that had been patient too long. But through it came the revenue cutter, her engine throttling down as she approached the shallows, and with her, a launch carrying uniformed men and 1 civilian in a dark coat who moved with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. They found the tower's entrance secured from outside. Crane's deputies had barred it. But Silas's signal lamp was still visible through the upper windows, still flashing its urgent pattern. The federal inspector, a man named Harrison with steel grey, hair and eyes that had seen too many crimes dressed up as ordered the door broken down. His men complied with efficiency that spoke of practice. Inside, they descended the spiral stairs to find Crane with his pistol drawn, Pike standing between him and Maggie, and water rising past everyone's knees. Inspector. Crane lowered his weapon immediately, his face smoothing into professional courtesy. Thank God you've arrived. These people broke into a secured county facility. I was attempting to maintain order until proper authorities— Sheriff Crane! Inspector Harrison's voice cut through the explanation like a knife through fog. I'm here because we received a federal distress signal, the same pattern used during naval emergencies. Are you telling me you fired a weapon at civilians, sending a call for help? They were trespassing, endangering themselves and destroying evidence. Evidence of what? Maggie stepped forward, water swirling around her legs, and held up the first ledger. Evidence of 20 years of theft, corruption, and murder. This chamber holds approximately $22 million in gold, diverted from War of 1812 espionage funds. And these ledgers document everyone Sheriff Crane paid to keep it secret. Harrison took the ledger. His expression didn't change as he read, but his jaw tightened with each page. These are payment records. To county officials. State representatives, he looked up. To sitting judges. My father discovered this vault, Maggie continued. He was going to report it. Someone sabotaged his boat. Sheriff Crane was seen in the area that night. That's a lie? Crane's composure cracked. The old keeper is senile. He sees ghosts and talks to gulls. No court would accept his testimony. But they'll accept mine. Pike's voice was steady now. He pulled a document from his coat, water-stained but legible. This is the real auction listing for the tower, dated 3 years ago, before Mrs. Whittaker's father died. It shows Captain Horace Whittaker as the legal owner. But this listing was withdrawn, and the property was illegally transferred to county holdings. By you, Sheriff. Using a forged deed, he handed the paper to Harrison. I found it in your desk when I was looking for the custodial order you claimed to have. That order was forged too. Different notary seal. Wrong date. I've been your deputy for 6 years, but I won't be your accomplice. Crane looked at Pike with something like betrayal in his eyes. Then he looked at the chamber's entrance, calculating distances and odds. He moved suddenly, lunging for the iron door. Silas's blacksmith arm caught him across the chest, stopping him like a wall. I don't think so. Pike stepped forward with handcuffs. His hands were steady as he secured them around Crane's wrists. Elias Crane, you're under arrest for falsifying official documents, theft of federal property, and suspicion of murder. The words seemed to echo in the flooded chamber. Mixing with the sound of rushing water and distant thunder, footsteps on the stairs announced more arrivals. Clara appeared with Keeper Jacob, both of them soaked from the storm, but moving with purpose. Clara carried a leather case that Maggie recognized, her late husband's records, Inspector Harrison. Clara's voice carried the authority of someone who'd survived loss and come through it stronger. These manifests show the smuggling routes my husband was forced to use. They match the dates in those ledgers, and they show which officials were paid to look the other way. I'm prepared to testify to all of it. Keeper Jacob moved to stand beside Maggie. As am I. I saw the boat that followed Horace Whittaker the night he died. I heard the engine. I know the sound of murder, even when it happens on dark water. Harrison looked at the assembled group, at Maggie with her father's compass, at Clara with her dead husband's truth, at Pike choosing conscience over career, at Keeper finally speaking after years of being dismissed as mad. Then he looked at Crane, handcuffed and silent. This chamber and everything in it is now under federal custody, Harrison said. Sheriff Crane, you'll be transferred to Portland to await trial. Deputy Pike, I'll need your full statement. Mrs. Whittaker, you and your associates have done your country a service today, the kind that rarely gets proper recognition, but deserves it nonetheless. He gestured to his men. "Secure this site, document everything, and get everyone topside before the tide gets any higher." As they climbed the spiral stairs, water chasing at their heels, Maggie looked back one final time at the chamber, at the goal that men had killed for, at the ledgers that would finally expose them, at the truth her father had died protecting. "Follow the signal," she whispered, "even when the world is fog." Spring came to the Maine coast with the tentative warmth of something that had learned not to rush. The tower stood against the blue sky like a sentinel that had finally earned its rest. Fresh paint brightened the weathered wood. New glass filled the windows. And inside, the sound of children's voices rose like birdsong. Maggie stood at the ground floor entrance, no longer a hidden chamber, but a proper classroom, and watched her students bent over their lessons. 12 children from the village, ranging from 6 to 14, all learning reading and arithmetic and the kind of careful observation her father had taught her years ago. The walls displayed maps and charts, but also something else, a small museum dedicated to the tower's history. The brass signal shutter Jacob had preserved, pieces of the crate stamped with federal eagles, and photographs of the ledgers, copies made before the originals were taken as evidence. Above it all, mounted in a place of honor, was her father's compass. The brass had been polished until it gleamed, and the engraved symbol now had a small plaque beneath it, explaining its meaning. Not a smuggler's mark, as Clara's husband had believed, but something older. A maritime signal for truth revealed by light. The mid-landing had been converted into a reading room, with comfortable chairs salvaged from ships and books donated from every household in the village. Clara managed it like the cultural treasury it was, cataloguing each volume and knowing exactly which child would be drawn to which story. The upper level, where the signal apparatus had once stood, now held a restored lighthouse lens Maggie had purchased with part of the recovery fee. On clear nights it swept its beam across the water, not as a warning this time, but as a beacon of welcome. The sealed iron door in the foundation remained, but now it bore a federal lock and a brass plate. Historical archive. Property of the United States government. Inside, the gold still sat in its crates, counted and documented, and waiting for Congress to decide its final disposition. The ledgers had been copied and distributed to 3 federal courts. Trials were pending. Pike had testified for 8 hours straight at the federal inquiry, his voice never wavering as he detailed every forged document, every coerced payment, every threat veiled as friendly advice that he'd witnessed during his years as deputy. When it was over, Inspector Harrison had offered him a position with the Revenue Cutter Service. Pike had accepted. Crane was in a Portland prison, awaiting trial on 17 counts of corruption, theft, and murder. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony damning. Even his expensive lawyers had begun discussing plea arrangements, and Maggie had become what the village needed. Not just a teacher, but a symbol. Proof that one person asking questions, refusing to accept comfortable lies, could change everything. The recovery fee had been substantial, $20,000 for her role in uncovering the theft and preserving the evidence. She'd used most of it to fund scholarships for sailors' children, to repair fishing boats for families who'd been crushed by Crane's inflated fees, to stock the library and pay for supplies her students needed. She kept enough for modest living expenses and a small apartment above Clara's Inn. That was all she wanted. All she needed. A knock on the doorframe made her turn. Silas stood there with a wrapped package, his blacksmith's hands gentle around whatever it contained. "Made something for the school," he said, his usual economy of words. "Thought you might want it." He unwrapped an iron bell, beautifully crafted, with a pull rope of braided hemp. The bell's surface bore an inscription in careful letters, Horace Whittaker Memorial School. "Follow the signal." Maggie felt her throat tighten. "Silas, it's perfect." "Thought so." He moved to hang it beside the entrance, his skilled hands making quick work of the mounting. When he pulled the rope, the bell's voice rang out clear and strong, carrying across the village and out over the water. Children looked up from their lessons. Clara appeared on the mid-landing with a smile. Even Keeper, dozing in the sun on the school's front steps, opened his eyes and nodded, as if the sound confirmed something he'd known all along. "Mrs. Whittaker?" One of the younger students raised her hand. "Why does the compass on the wall have that strange symbol?" Maggie walked to the window where the compass hung. Outside, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, blue and white and eternal. Somewhere out there, her father's boat had capsized. But somewhere out there, too, the truth had finally surfaced. "It's a reminder," Maggie said, choosing her words carefully, "that even in the darkest fog, there's always a signal if you're brave enough to look for it. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is keep that light burning, even when everyone tells you to let it go out." The girl nodded seriously, committing the answer to memory. The school day continued. Lessons in grammar and arithmetic, stories read aloud, questions asked and answered, the ordinary work of education that was never really ordinary at all. That evening, after the children had gone home and Clara had locked the library, Maggie climbed to the upper level and stood beside the restored lens. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple that no artist could properly capture. Silas joined her, and then Clara and finally Keeper, climbing slowly but surely to stand with them. "He'd be proud," Keeper said softly. "Your father?" "Of what you built, from what he left behind." "We built it," Maggie corrected. "All of us together, and it was true." The tower stood not as one person's victory, but as proof of what happened when people chose truth over comfort, courage over fear, community over corruption. The lighthouse lens began its sweep, the beam cutting across the darkening water in steady, reliable arcs, a signal that said, "Here we are here. We survived. We remember. We will not be silenced." Below them, the village stirred into evening routines. Lamps lit in windows, boats secured at the docks, families gathering around tables, life continuing in the ordinary, extraordinary way it did when people felt safe enough to trust tomorrow. And in the Watchtower that had once held secrets dark enough to kill for, children would return in the morning to learn that the most valuable treasure wasn't gold hidden in chambers beneath the earth. It was truth, brought into the light and shared freely with anyone brave enough to seek it. Maggie touched her father's compass one final time before descending. The metal was cool now, the way memorial objects should be. But the lesson it taught, follow the signal, even when the world is fog, that burned as bright as any lighthouse beam, and would continue burning, she thought, for as long as there were people willing to see it. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.